Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to this talk about DataWeave. I am always appreciative for people coming to a talk that's not just about AI, so thank you. If any part of this title doesn't make sense to you yet, don't worry. I will explain every one of those three elements as we go through. Before we get into the main content of this presentation, I need to warn you that this contains backwards-looking statements. This DataWeave is already generally available. If you want to make purchasing decisions about DataWeave, you can. You don't need to contact your A. Aside from general kind of amusement of this, one of the reasons I want to put this slide in is that there are actual performance numbers that I've taken about how DataWeave works, and that may well change over time. I played with the pilot of DataWeave, and it had a really slow startup time, and then they fixed that, which is great. So maybe they'll see this and performance will change. But there's a GitHub repo that you can go to rerun these experiments or check them out for yourselves if you want to. I'm going to put that link on again at the end as well. So if you don't catch it here, don't worry. So quickly about me. My name's Aidan Harding. I'm CTO at Processity. My dog has a very long tongue. My career in 3 bullet points: I did a PhD in computer science, which is about model checking with agents, quite a long time ago. I did 9 years at a Salesforce consulting partner. And now I've been at Processity. We're an ISV partner. And I want to tell you a little bit about the company, partly because my sales guy will kill us if we don't, but also because I got interested in DataWeave to actually try and use it in our product. So what we're doing with Processity is we're building a process mining solution for Salesforce so that when you analyze your data, you can find out what your business processes are from the actual changes in the data rather than what people say they do. Actually, what is it that they do, and potentially find optimizations or things that don't work as you want. And as a first stage to that, we built a field tracking tool so that we could capture all of those changes. And as you can imagine, if you're building a field tracking tool, one of the core things that you need to do is take a pair of lists of records and find out what's changed between them. Obviously, I wrote all this in Apex, and then I thought, hey, maybe DataWeave would be good for this sort of thing. So I spent some time evaluating DataWeave, probably a bit too much time, and I thought, why not turn into this presentation? So the 3 elements from the title. First off, what is ETL? Extract, transform, load. It's the common way that people talk about moving data between systems. So when we're extracting something, say we've got an SAP system, we pull the data out of there, it comes in a particular format. That might be CSV, XML, whatever it happens to be coming out of there. And then we pass that into a transform stage. And this is really the domain of DataWeave, is this transform stage is what it helps you with. And the kinds of changes you would make there are the field names might be different on the 2 sides of the records, but we're also doing data transformations along the way. So here we've got an invoice ID on the left-hand side, which is unique in the SAP world. And if we want it to be unique in the target system, we're going to put a system identifier together with that invoice ID and make something that really will be unique. And we've got a bunch of other sort of common changes here in this example, like the country goes from UK to the ISO code. The price was in pennies on one side, we turn it into pounds on the other side. All these sorts of transformations are the sorts of things that DataWeave should be good for helping you with in this transform stage. And once we transformed it, we load it into a target system. And so again, there's a file format going on, typically, of how that stuff goes in here. So DataWeave is kind of filling in the bit that looks green on my screen, but hasn't come up very well in color on there, that transform section. And a little bit into the file formats as well is another part that it can help you with. Who is Mr. T, or do you remember the 80s? Yeah. Well, that's what I thought. It was obvious, but one of my colleagues is very young and doesn't know the 80s, so, you know. So he was born as Lawrence Tureau, and as he tells it, he decided to call himself Mr. T because when he was a child, growing up in Chicago, white people would refer to even his dad as boy as a sort of disrespectful way of talking to them. And he wanted to make sure that the first thing people said when they addressed him was Mr. and not boy. And he had a varied career. He was a doorman, a bodyguard, a boxer. He was in the A-team, which is really what I know him for. And all the time that he was doing these things, he was still connected back to his community and helping out with community projects and things. And an interesting thing about him now is that he doesn't actually wear the gold chains anymore. So in that kind of community work spirit, he was helping to clean up after Hurricane Katrina. And he said that he was looking around at all these people who'd lost lives and homes and things, and he actually felt like the gold chains weren't appropriate anymore. And so he's dropped that part of his character. I think it's interesting that there's so much more to Mr. T than the guy who would throw fools in the A-team. And one of the things that he likes to say is he believes in taking care of business. And I think one of the things about DataWeave, to bring it back to all of that stuff, is that it's a tool that can practically get stuff done for you. I kind of joked about AI, but one of the things about AI is it's not yet taking care of business, I would say. It's kind of maybe in the future it will. And one of the other things about Mr. T is it's a very particular kind of actor. You know what he's going to do. He's not going to play Hamlet. He's going to do his kind of role. And the tenuous link to DataWeave is that DataWeave is that same sort of thing where it's a very specific language for a specific domain and a specific kind of thing. So what is DataWeave? Particularly, we're interested in Apex. It's the transformation language inside MuleSoft. And it's a functional language. And functional languages are great and cool and mathematical. And the real difference between a functional language and a language like Apex is the kind of the base unit that we're thinking of when we're writing in that language. In Apex, it's an object, which is a data with some methods around it. In DataWeave, in a functional language, the data and the functions are kept separately, and we're thinking in terms of functions, and we can pass functions around, and that makes it easier to write generic transformations. And DataWeave is supported by a whole bunch of standard libraries to do clever tricks with that data. So it has functions like capitalize, which is quite clever. It can understand what snake case is and turn that into title case. It has a really cool pluralize that understands that dog, sheep, goose goes to dogs, sheep, geese, which sounds like a kind of pointless trick. But if you think about a scenario where you're taking something like an invoice with line items and trying to generate a description, this is exactly the sort of transformation that you might need and would be painful to do in Apex. It can be run as a CLI tool. You can download it and run it to do data manipulations. And there's also an online playground that you can get to from MuleSoft, where you have kind of 3 columns on the screen. On the left-hand side, you create some sample data. In the middle, you write some DataWeave, and on the right, it dynamically shows the outputs of your script, which means it's quite easy to learn that way. It supports I/O in a whole number of formats, and this is one of the things that Apex programmers love about it. So we can work directly with JSON, we can work with Apex objects, so if we have a list of records, we can just send them straight to DataWeave and it can manipulate those, and it can handle CSV files. One thing to note is that DataWeave in Apex doesn't support all the same files. So it doesn't support Excel and a number of other formats, which would be quite nice if it did. So generally, as I said, I was trying to assess whether DataWeave would be any use for us. And with apologies to Edgar Allan Poe, and put it in terms of the pitch and the pendulum. So if I'm looking at technology, what is the pitch? If I watch the 5-minute video from Salesforce, what is it telling me that this thing is? What's it for? What do they sell it as? And it's important to have that first understanding, but it's definitely not the end of the story. On the sort of pendulum side, we've got the maybe this, maybe that, trade-off sort of questions that the senior engineers tend to come up. So is it going to serve the sorts of changes we expect in our system? Generally, if we're going to architect a system well, we know it's going to change. We've probably got some ideas about the kind of ways it's going to change. So is this technology going to help us with those? What are the downsides? There always are downsides. So we need to understand where this thing's not going to be appropriate. And what's the adoption like? Do people talk about this thing? If I Google my problems, am I going to find answers? And what are the alternative technologies as well? If we're choosing this, we're obviously rejecting that. So how can we make these kinds of decisions? So we're going to answer all of these questions through the talk and then come back to this assessment. So let's look at DataWeave with this specific problem. And as I said, one of the cases that we were looking at was this idea of comparing 2 lists of records and finding out what the differences are. So if we've got a record that looks like that, it's got a bunch of personal information and values and all of those things. And then we've got another one, we want to find where those two things have changed. And if your eyes are darting around looking at that, there's where the change is. Those two parts of the name have changed. So we want to write a DataWeave script that takes an input like this and produces an output like that, which is a list of all of the changes. So each of the changes is going to have the record ID, the old value, the new value, and which field it was that changed. So to give us a baseline of performance for this, and also to make sure that we really understand the problem, we'll write it in a language that we already know. So let's do it in Apex. And if we have an Apex method to get the changes from these two lists, it's going to look a bit like this, where we start off by making a list of results, and we're going to return that, and in the middle, we're going to fill in that list. And what that's going to do is it's going to iterate through the array of old records, and for each pair of old and new records, it's going to generate some changes and add that to the list. So then all the interesting stuff's going to happen in a method that we see on the next slide, where we just compare two records. Same sort of pattern. Create a list, return a list. In the middle, we're going to populate it with some stuff. So what we need to do is go through all the fields that we need to compare, and then get the values for that field from the old record and the new record. And if they're different, then that's when we're going to construct one of these field change records. And we're converting them all to strings here, because that's the output that we want. And very simply, we just create a container to throw this thing into. So that's an Apex implementation of finding differences. And what we can do then is we can do some performance testing on that. So I went way too far down the rabbit hole of building an Apex performance testing framework thing, which allowed us to have a number of different sample sizes, different iterations at that sample size, and then gather together lots of results, which, yeah, it's in that repo. I might separate it out because I found it kind of interesting. So we could take the thing that we ran, and we could run it with 1,000 to 6,000 records at different sizes. And we can see it's taking, I don't know, about 300 milliseconds to do 1,000 records, and then sort of linearly increasing. And you can see the spread of dots being one of the challenges of doing performance testing in Apex is sometimes it's faster, sometimes it's slower. So you do actually need to do this. You can't just run it a couple of times and say, hey, one thing's better than another. So if you're eagle-eyed, you'll notice that I called that the naive Apex implementation, because that was the one I showed you on the slide. And if you're used to doing string things, you might have noticed that what I showed you would not detect changes in case, because case-sensitive comparison. So the real one that we do is longer and doesn't fit on a slide. And it's also more efficient, and so the better version, because he comes up with a lower line, and that helped to convince me that my performance testing framework also is doing the kinds of things that I expect. If I've made some of the loops more efficient, it has come out faster, so that's good stuff. So right, let's try and build this thing in DataWeave. So here's a DataWeave script. At the top, we're declaring the inputs that are going to be passed in from Apex. So it's just like our Apex version. It's taking in the new list, old list, and the fields to compare. And it's going to provide an output as an Apex thing. And the three dashes at the bottom of the DataWeave separate out. That's going to be the result of the script. So one of the things about DataWeave is that as a functional language, it's got built-in list processing methods, which would be familiar to people who work in JavaScript and Python and things. So it's got the map method, which is going to work on an array and return you a new array where every element has been mapped to a new value by applying a function to it. So the map that we're going to apply in this DataWeave script is going to take an individual record and an index, and it's going to call compare fields, just like we did in Apex, in a pair of records rather than, so we've gone from the lists to a single record. And then the question is, how does compare fields as a thing look? So it's another list processing function that we're using here, the filter function. And this kind of illustrates one of the things about DataWeave is if you're used to these list processing functions, you will love them. If you've never used them before, it's a bit of a brain scratch to get to know them, but once you know them, you tend to love them. So it's good that they're there. So what the filter one does is it processes a list by taking a Boolean function and giving you a smaller list with only the elements that returned true with that function. So to compare the fields, we're going to go through the list of all the fields, and we're only going to keep the fields where the record value changed between the old and the new one. So if they did change, we're going to pile up our list processing things, and now we're going to do a map to return one of these field change records that we've constructed on the fly with the new record ID, the field, and the old and new value. And you can see that we're converting to strings by telling DataWeave we want the thing to be a string, and we're also telling it the class of the Apex object that we want it to return. And that means that when we receive this in Apex, it all works out type-wise. So there's one last thing in the DataWeave script is that the result of what's on the screen there is actually a two-dimensional list that for each record, it has its own list of changes. So the last thing we need to do is apply flatten, which is another DataWeave function to say, if you've got a 2D array, turn it into a 1D array with all the list elements in it. So that's how we can find the differences in DataWeave. And I can run this through the performance analysis thing. Ooh, DataWeave, oh dear. It comes out much higher and also much more spread out. And that is not great news, I would say. It's consistently comes out less predictable. I ran these things a few times, and it consistently comes out higher. So you can almost say, well, let's just close the book. DataWeave is no good. Let's give up. But let's find out what specific ways it's not great for this, and are there other ways and places where it is actually going to be useful. One of the things that I took away from this result is probably best not use it in triggers. If there's a risk of it sometimes taking 3/4 of your allocated CPU time, I'm not putting that in a trigger. But there are places where it could be useful. So I was wondering about what part of DataWeave it is that's causing it to be slower than Apex. So I thought, we're going from one language to another? Is it crossing that language barrier that's making us so slow? So if I wrote a very simple DataWeave script that just takes a list of records and converts them to JSON and returns it, what kind of performance do we get from that? So it was worth building this performance framework because I got to run it loads of times. So this is just pass through in DataWeave, converting to JSON at various sizes from 10 to 1,000 records. We can still see quite a spray of dots. It's moving linearly, but it's taking 500 milliseconds just to get the records into DataWeave there. As a comparison, if you took the same list of records and called the Apex serialize method, much flatter. And what that makes me wonder is maybe it's the conversion from Apex to JSON that's causing DataWeave to have a problem. So what I did was made a pass-through DataWeave script that's just takes some JSON input, does nothing to it, and just dumps it back out. And now we've got a measure of what the cost is to just cross the language barrier, never mind any type conversions. Which is frankly a baffling result. The bottom line of blue dots was what I was expecting to get. The spray of blue dots higher up, I mean, I ran this thing multiple times and it had this pattern both times. I don't know. So it seems like if you convert things to JSON before you send it to DataWeave, that definitely helps, but it doesn't help every time. And we could take that same methodology of saying, let's convert everything to JSON before we send it to DataWeave and apply it to our detecting changes in records algorithm. So the same thing, but with JSON input, is the yellow line here. So we can see that we've improved the DataWeave performance a little bit by pre-processing everything into JSON, but it's still not as far down as Apex. But why? Why so slow, DataWeave? I got a nice clue about why DataWeave is so slow when I hit a heap exception, because it ran out of memory, which is one of the gotchas for DataWeave is that it shares the heap limit with Apex. So if you have the same data in 2 different formats, you're using twice as much space, and DataWeave is using that, and you can blow it up. And when I did blow it up, I got a stack trace that was 272 lines deep. And if you took each of those lines and they were 1 centimeter high, that would be 2.72 meters, or about the size of an Alaskan moose, which that's quite a lot of friction between Apex and DataWeave. So, bit of a concern. But, little awe for the dinosaur there. I think one of the conclusions I came to from that is about transforming and serializing data. Something that is really kind of shocking to me when you're using web apps is how many transformations your data goes through just to get from the server to you. And often too many people are doing it out of safety. If you went through the stage of Aura Lightning components, you probably turned everything into strings because it was really unreliable to send it to the front end, and some people were just continuously JSONing everything all the time. And I'd like people to remember, every time you do that, you're using energy and time and tossing another dinosaur in the fire. I think we want to do as little of that as possible. And if we want to minimize those sorts of things, we can come to a conclusion about DataWeave that it's best if your I/O is already in a file format and it's already in something that DataWeave is handling. And so if you've got a load of CSV files already, it's much better at parsing those than your half-assed Apex implementation, and it's already in a string format that costs you less performance. So that's one of the places where it's really useful. And one of the other things on the plus side of DataWeave is that it has an internal representation of objects in a very generic way, and because it's a functional language, it gives us the potential of being able to write a DataWeave script that is very generic and can handle lots of situations and doesn't need modification in the future. So finally, having said that this was about transforms and then going on about comparing field changes, let's do a transform in DataWeave. So like before, just set out what we're trying to do. So if I'm given a list of records like this that has some contact style information, and then I'm also going to take as an input a list of transformations that I want to apply to that. So where the field was first name, I want to turn it into the snake case version of first name. I want to capitalize it. For the state, I want to change it to just state and uppercase it. So this is what I'm going to provide to my DataWeave, the records and also what I want to do with those records. So the way that that looks to call DataWeave from Apex is I create a list of contacts that were just what you saw on the last slide. I create a list of transforms. And the important part about this is that this list of transforms could come from anywhere. It could come from user input, building it up through a web component. It could come from custom metadata. It could come from anywhere. And thinking of, is this going to work for the future changes that I'm going to anticipate? This is the kind of thing that's actually really useful. If someone needs to add a new field, they don't have to crack open DataWeave. They can change what ends up in this list. And then when I call DataWeave, I'm passing in those two things, and DataWeave takes over from there, and it returns us a result. So hopefully this will be the version of the script that we don't need to edit again. So how does this look in DataWeave? I will preface this with, if you don't already know how to program in DataWeave, I'm probably going to lose you, and that's my fault, not your fault. What I really want you to take away is that you can write a DataWeave script this generically. So I will try to explain it, but I always feel like I'm not explaining it very well. So don't panic if it doesn't make sense. So what this generic transform script looks like is it's taking those two inputs that we were expecting, the records and the transforms, and it's going to output some JSON because we don't know what the target object's going to be. Kind of as we'd expect, the thing that it's returning below the 3 dashes is the records that were input with a map function applied to it that transforms all the records. So far, fine. How does it transform all the records? We've got another one of these list processing functions there, which is the reduce method. So that takes a list of inputs and smushes it down to a single value. So if you had a list of numbers, then you could reduce it to the sum of those numbers, for example. Or in this case, if we have a list of transforms that we want to do, we can smush it down to a single new record. And that's what we're going to do here. So the reduce method looks a bit strange, I admit. So it's applying a function that takes the transform that we're applying right now and an accumulator, which is the sort of object that we're constructing. And we're saying there that it starts off being an empty object, and we're going to add fields to it, field by field, as we go through the transforms. And that plus plus operator is a sort of object concatenation thing, like object assign in JavaScript, that's making all this stuff work. So the thing that we're creating here is the field part of it is the target field that we got from the transform. And the value that we're adding this time is something that we're going to get by calling a function that we're going to see on the next slide called transform value. So this allows us to generically process all of those records. And so we'll go over to transform value. And what you see here is I've got an object with all the available functions that I'm going to allow in this script defined. So DataWeave doesn't really have a concept where if you have the name of a function as a string, I can't turn that into a function that I can call. But if I have a map with a bunch of functions in it, I can use that string to look up the right function and then apply it later. And so that's got pluses and minuses. It means that the people who are making the configuration can't do some crazy transformations that bring the whole system down. They can only do the things you've told them to do. But it does mean you might have to crack open the DataWeave script to add a new line to this. So pluses and minuses there. So the bit below the 3 dashes there, what this function is going to return is it's going to return the result of applying a function. So there are those round brackets with a big gap in them that I'm going to reveal the contents of. That's going to return a function. And then where it's got value after that, it's going to apply the value to the function that we've looked up. So it literally just reads from the function map, given the transformation that we've been told to use. And if it can't find one, it uses the identity function. And so this gives us a nice DataWeave transformation that we can apply without having to change it if we need to add new fields. And I think this is a useful thing to know about DataWeave, is that we could build something that can be reused in places like Apex and Flow, where the configuration parts come in and it's super generic. So if you've only got one person who knows DataWeave, then other people can still make use of their work. So going back to our original criteria of how we make decisions about technologies, it's important to consider the alternatives. If we're in this world of I want to transform records and I want to make sure that it's generic and configurable by admins, definitely one of the options that you have is the flow transform element, I think. I've heard of it. I've never used it. It seems like it should do the thing. Someone else's talk should get into that. Another option is go full caveman and write your own Apex for every single transform that you do. Okay, but you'll be replaced by AI one day. Go write your own fully generic version of Apex transforms. So when I was at Nebula Consulting, we wrote a fully generic transformer for Apex. And it basically had to introduce functional programming to Apex to work. It's quite a heavy lift, but does the job. You can do that. Another option, if you're in this kind of world, which is the one forward-looking statement, is formula evaluation in Apex might be really good for this, actually. If we had our transform record somehow where we had the formulas to say how it goes from left to right, that could be really good. And you can actually see this coming in and how data cloud and things are configured. Salesforce are doing this stuff in the background themselves. And of course, if you do have MuleSoft or Boomi, stop coding immediately and just use them. They're really great tools. It's what they're meant for. But yeah, if you don't have them, then you don't have them. And they're expensive to buy for just one thing. So those are your other options there. So what have we learned overall? The pitch for DataWeave is that it is a language that's well suited to doing these data transformations. And The reasons for that are it is functional, and that is a good way of approaching data transformation stuff. It does have that strong ability to do input and output in different file formats. The library functions are really useful and worth delving through. And because it has the CLI tool, we can sort of string together systems, and a DataWeave script that we've written to be used in Apex is something that we could call from the CLI. So when we're messing around with data, that's a useful thing to do. And our kind of pros and cons side of this thing, will it serve the sorts of changes we expect? Well, it supports the common I/O formats, and it's not too difficult to change those, although you can't choose them dynamically, as far as I'm aware. I'm pretty sure on that. But we can change things by writing generic scripts that pass in the parameters. That's definitely a good thing. Downsides, learning the language if you don't already know it, and particularly if you've not programmed in a language like it before, it's quite hard work. And if your one DataWeave person leaves the company, you're left with a piece of tech debt for sure. Performance, as we saw, is an issue in just getting to DataWeave. It's pretty efficient once the data is there, and it's better if you're already in a file kind of situation. What's the adoption like? Will it still be there in the future? Do people talk about it? It's pretty good. If you search for DataWeave difficulties, you will find, because it's so extensively used in MuleSoft, people are talking about it on Stack Overflow. You can get answers to the questions you have. I thought the documentation was quite good. I was talking to someone this morning who disagreed. I don't know. Maybe it's changed, or maybe it doesn't work for some people. And one of the other things is that AI tools know about DataWeave. So you can go to ChatGPT and say, write me a script to do that, and it'll write you a script that nearly does that, and then you can debug it, which might be better than starting from a blank page. That's actually it. I've rattled through that much quicker than I expected, but that gives you plenty of time to have a look at the QR code if you want to try and have a look in that repo and ask any questions that you would like.